So friends, things are going to be a bit different today. I spoke to 3 different eating disorder experts and 2 trans athletes with lived experiences about why trans people are more likely to struggle with eating disorders compared to cis people. Welcome back to Bend and Snatch. I'm Penny and this is episode 23. So I've been working on this episode for a few months now, and bringing it together has really been one of the hardest things I've ever done in terms of content creation. So I really hope people listen to it, watch it, share it, do all of that stuff, and it becomes a useful resource. This all started because I wanted to know how easy it was for people to tell the difference between body dysmorphia and gender dysphoria. I wanted to know because last year I actually fell back into some disordered behaviours myself. And it was for the first time in years. And I really wanted to try and dissect why I was struggling, where it was coming from, how much of it was gender related, how much of it was something else. Now, working in the fitness space, I'm sure it's to the surprise of absolutely nobody that I know a lot of people with histories of disordered eating and even eating disorders. And I also know a lot of trans people specifically who've struggled with EDs. So my first step in trying to understand my own brain was to just ask a few of the people around me. Now, unfortunately, one of these conversations actually triggered someone in their own eating disorder. And I immediately realized I needed a better plan. But I also still wanted to hear from other people. So I decided to do this episode and I immediately put the feelers out to see if anybody wanted to talk to me. In the UK, around 0.5% of people identify as trans or non-binary, according to 2023 stats from the Office of National Statistics. And this tiny minority group of people are struggling with huge rates of eating disorders or disordered eating. Around 18% of trans men and women have had an eating disorder at some point in their life. Now, that's compared to just 1.8% of cis women and 0.2% of cis men. These numbers are really bolstered by the genderqueer and gender expansive folks. So they reported the highest rates, around 11 to 12%. That's compared to trans men at 9.6% and trans women at 4%. Gender non-conforming people, presumed female at birth, had the highest rates of anyone diagnosed and self-reported eating disorders. Why? Why is this happening? Join me as I try and find out. This episode's probably going to be split across 2 episodes because I've got about 4 hours of interview stuff and loads of it's really interesting. So I'm going to split it, edit it, so there's going to be not 4 hours of stuff. So without further ado, let's get on with it.
Okay, so my name's Olive and I am, well, the wanky title I like to give myself is a mixed movement coach. But it basically means I sort of teach everything across the spectrum of yoga, not just postural yoga, but everything that comes within the philosophy of the practice. I'm also a personal trainer and strength coach. And why am I qualified to talk about eating disorders? I guess largely because I went through one myself. I had a mixture of anorexia and orthorexia for a few years in my early or late teens to early 20s. And I've sort of navigated going through that, navigated recovery myself. And I've also sort of experienced a bunch of clients over the years who have had similar histories.
When did your eating disorder kind of manifest and what did that look like for you?
I think the trigger point for me was my first major breakup in high school. And there was a lot surrounding that as well. It's coming to the end of my A levels. So there was a lot of preparation in terms of the exams and prepping to leave the country that I grew up in and move to the UK. So there's a lot of surrounding factors where I felt very much out of control. And the one thing that I learned I could control was, obviously how much I move and train, but also what I then ate. And I'd always been someone who trained and moved quite a lot. I was very involved in sports, but in that period of time, I started doing a lot of at home HIIT training sessions. There was the Nike app that I did, and then there was the Bikini Body Guide from an online coach that I followed religiously for ages. So that was sort of the orthorexia component. But the nutrition side at first, it was I just want to be healthy. And then slowly from there, I started cutting out more and more food groups. I then transitioned to being pescatarian, and then I also cut out dairy, and then I cut out all animal products basically, and used veganism as an excuse to hide my eating disorder because people wouldn't question why I was only eating veg for dinner. I'll be like, oh no, but I'm vegan now.
How did you realize that something was wrong?
I think I was in denial about it for quite a long time because there was a lot of people at my school who were constantly reaffirming how good I looked. And again, I have never been someone who's been in a bigger body. I've always been, relatively the size that I am, but it was still alarming at how many people still were commenting on the weight loss that I was experiencing. Um, but then when I moved to university, everyone only knew me as that size, and it was also winter, so, wearing loads of jumpers, so no one really knew what I was going through apart from my family, but my family were, like, all the way back in Dubai, and I'm now in the UK, so they couldn't directly help me out. So I think I only really realized it maybe when I went home that Christmas. My parents pretty much like sat me down, or like, if you don't sort this out, you're not going back because it's hurting us so much and we're seeing you struggle. And I don't think I had really fully conceptualized what I was doing.
What sort of things was it affecting?
A lot of it was like very physical stuff. Like I was just constantly cold, like all the time, no matter, how many layers I put on, I was just always freezing. So my circulation was pretty bad. I also lost my period for like maybe close to a year, and I had a really bad iron deficiency as well. And later on down the line, that fell into like the realm of chronic fatigue quite a lot and loads of brain fog. And I'm like, in my first year of university, I'm finding it really hard to retain information. And also just feeling like generally just quite fragile. It was, the first term of university, and I was so scared to go out for meals with people, and even go out at night because I didn't want to drink because I had so much fear around that. So I was missing out on all these early interactions with people and missing out quite a lot socially. And that really affected me for like the remaining 3 years of uni.
Yeah, that's rubbish.
Yeah.
How old are you now?
29.
How did you get better?
It was pretty slow. I think obviously the initial point at which I realized what was happening to me over that Christmas, it wasn't like it was an instantaneous change. I became more conscious of it, but I was still religiously tracking and I was still religiously overtraining. So I was stuck in that mindset for perhaps like another 18 months or so. But it was only really when I stopped being vegan, maybe in the end of 2018. So this is like 4 years on from like pretty much the start, or 4.5 years on, that I think I finally let go of the over restriction. Because again, like a vegan diet, plant-based diet, it is restrictive, and I think that was still keeping me mentally very much tied to the eating disorder. And it was only when I sort of like started to reintroduce different foods where it was like, oh, I can eat anything. I don't have to have all these like little rules anymore, and that really helped.
Since then, have you found yourself like feeling fine and not being kind of pulled back towards it, or have you felt any pulls?
I've like experimented. After I stopped being vegan, there was a period where I was like eating a normal omnivore diet, and then I went the complete other way and I went carnivore for a few months. Which is like wild in hindsight. Like me and my ex, we experimented with it for a little while, kind of just wanted to see what was going on. So in total, it was maybe about 6 months. The first like couple months weren't super strict. And then there was the January of 2020 where it was like incredibly strict. So that's like including no fruit, no veg, no condiments. And I was like, I just want to see how this goes. But then at the end of that, we went to go see my parents. This is just before COVID, so maybe March time of 2020. And my mum made some like beautiful food. She's a great cook. And I wanted to eat it, obviously. And I ate it and I had such a bad gut reaction to like literally just pasta and a fucking salad. And it was at that point where I was like, this is actually ridiculous. I don't want a diet to affect my ability to literally just eat a piece of fruit. So at that point, I was like, okay, I'm done with like all these weird extremes. I just want to have a normal diet. So that was kind of like the catalyst of me just eating a little bit more intuitively and eating because I wanted to and because I enjoyed it. If you're out in a day to day and you're like, oh God, hunger pang, that's not the triggering thing. What is more worrying for me is if I am tracking and consciously in a calorie deficit or whatever, if I feel that pang of starvation, that reminds me of being like, I'm doing something right. And that's what the trigger is. And that's the thing that's concerning. So it's trying to, navigate that with the knowledge that I have now and not let myself completely derail and slip off.
How do you keep yourself safe from that?
It's a really good question because I only recently realized that. If I was to observe myself now from when I did it last time, it's knowing that in the grand scheme of things, like what is a couple of kilos of difference to me and like how it feels and like why am I chasing that sensation of starvation and like what does it mean? Because it's a really odd like, oh, I'm doing something right, I'm rewarding myself by feeling this, but trying to rewrite that narrative of like, well, no, your body's telling you you need food right now, you need it to fuel your training, you need it to fuel being there for your clients, because you know historically that if you don't eat, the brain fog that comes in, the energy that you lose, you just can't do your day-to-day things. And like I love being able to be there for friends, be there for my partner, be there to move and train myself, and I can't do that if I'm not properly fueled. So I think that's kind of the knowledge that I go with now.
When did you know that you were trans?
I wouldn't necessarily identify as trans. I'd be more non-binary. I think I properly came out as non-binary 2 summers ago. I kind of like slowly eased myself in, like slowly um started interchangeably using like she, they, and then suddenly started realizing I was more uncomfortable with being referred to as she, and then started introducing like they, them to close friends, and then slowly to like the wider world. But it started because I went out with one of my best friends. We went for a queer night out and they introduced me to some of their friends. And instantly, these friends were like, oh, what are your pronouns? And it was genuinely the first time someone has ever asked me that. I was like, oh shit. It kind of took me a little bit by surprise. But it was that, again, that point of being a catalyst that made me start questioning things. And I think I've always felt, growing up, I always felt incredibly uncomfortable being very feminine with like the clothes that I wore or just the way that I tended to present. So I always fell more within the realms of non-binary. I just didn't understand what that meant. But also like learning it a little bit more, non-binary can mean whatever I want it to mean. And I can be and present and dress however I choose. I think letting go of like the labels of being someone who is she, her, and being more they, them is like, I just feel a little bit more comfortable to express myself how I want to. Some days I dress like this, some days I dress like that, and that's just an extension of how I feel in myself.
Do you ever struggle with any gender dysphoria?
Yeah, there are aspects of it. I remember, like, again, growing up or going to university, just never feeling like I looked the right part or like I looked feminine enough for people to be interested in me. And which was interesting because I never wanted to be that. But society was saying that I needed to look like that in order to get validation, in order to get attention from, other people. And it's such a weird concoction of emotions that you're dealing with at university anyways. And I think a lot of it also comes from like being mixed race and feeling like I'm not the beauty standard that's presented to the wider world. When I came out as non-binary, a lot of the gender dysphoria that I did feel, like, it always felt like I was performing when I would wear a dress or I would wear, like, a skirt or anything like that. I felt wildly uncomfortable. But then now identifying as non-binary, I'm like, "Oh, cool." I feel pretty comfortable wearing that because I'm more comfortable in myself. It was interesting shaving my head. It felt very, very cathartic, and it was something I had wanted to do for a very long time. My mate who shaved my head, she had done hers, like, years ago and said it was, like, the most beautiful she ever felt. And, like, when she did that, I was like, "Holy shit," like, you're just looking at yourself in a very, very different lens. Like, your hair's not there to kind of mask you anymore. And, I've got a lot of, like, self-consciousness around my hair because when I had my eating disorder, I lost so much hair. Like, my hair used to be down to my hip, and I cut it all off, and then it just got thinner and thinner and thinner. So I have a lot of, like, yeah, awareness of what it looks like, and it's constantly a thing that I think about. So, yeah, when she shaved it, it was almost like a little weight off my chest. I was like, "Okay." But I just am hating the regrowth process. It's just really long and boring.
It is a really long, boring process, and you have to go through phases of looking really silly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's okay.
Yeah. It's fine. I'm like, "You know what? It's alright."
Do you think that the gender dysphoria and like the body dysmorphia are connected in any way?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I don't think I've fully sat down with this question before and fully unpacked it, so this might come out as, like, the thoughts are coming into my head. But I've always had an idea in my head of, like, what I would like not necessarily to look like, but, I'd like to have, like, I'd like to just look visibly strong. And I think sometimes within the work that I do, I'm not a coach who necessarily pushes for body recomp or anything like that, or necessarily like physique goals or weight loss. If a client wants to come to me for that, I can help them, but I don't necessarily market myself in that way. It doesn't mean that I don't have goals. Like those two things can exist alongside one another. So I think I have goals in my head of what I would like to look like physically and feel like physically and be able to attain. And I think they do line up with aspects of gender for me. When I look at myself, I look like I have a very feminine body. And actually, now you've said this and it's bringing stuff up. Like when I got, when I was maybe about 25, I don't know what the hell happened, but suddenly my hips just fucking started forming. Like they were ready for childbirth. And I was like, it threw me massively because it changed the way clothes sat on me. It changed the way that like I looked at myself, and it was very uncomfortable to view at the start. Especially as someone I don't want kids. So I was like, why is this happening? Um, so yeah, having like a little bit more of a curvy anatomy that way took me a long time to be okay with. And I think feeling like I want visibly stronger arms or like a stronger lower body has kind of helped me try counteract it a little bit more in my head.
Did you know that trans people are more likely to have eating disorders, with non-binary people being even more likely to have eating disorders compared to like trans men and trans women, and then compared by like 5 times as much to cis people?
No, that's fucking crazy.
So here I just shared those trans eating disorder stats that I shared with you at the beginning of the episode.
I think the one thing I'll probably come back to is like the feeling of a of control, like not really knowing who you are or having a solid like concept of your identity. Because I think with like, again, being non-binary, it's not necessarily like an obvious path for you, when you're growing up, like, I don't know, unless like you're within circles already. I didn't fucking know what non-binary was until a couple of years ago. Like I had no idea. I just knew that I had all these feelings that I couldn't really express. So I think a lot of it is like this sort of lack of control, maybe feeling like you're a little bit in a limbo state and you're trying to grasp some level of control back. And I think it's a little bit more ambiguous with being non-binary. Like you can approach it however you want to. Not that you can't do that, with being a trans man or trans woman, but I feel like there's more ambiguity within it.
How does hearing those stats make you feel in your soul?
I think partly reaffirming.
That's nice.
Yeah, in a weird kind of way. It makes me a bit sad. Like, I don't know, just hearing stats about eating disorders just make me sad anyway, because I think it's something so prevalent that we often don't really give a lot of like serious conversation about. I saw something the other day that just made me really sad. It was this one, I can't remember who the content creator was. I feel like they're within the realm of psychology for eating disorders, but they asked like their audience something, and the audience sort of response was like, my nan was, this is pretty dark, like my nan was really, really sick, like dying from cancer, and all she could think about was how skinny her body was looking. And it's like, and there was a lot of similar stories about that, being about how long and for how many years these women have been viewing their body or only ever dieting or only ever wanting to be skinny, and that's just taken so much of their headspace away. And it's like that sort of stuff just makes me like perpetually sad, because I was in that position for years. That was the only thing I could think about. Everything else took a back seat, and as a result, like I lost out on so much life. So I think that's a sad part for me.
It is really sad. I think it's so normalized that most people don't even notice that their behaviors are disordered. Whenever I've been the least okay, that's always when I get the most compliments about how good I look. And then I'm like, oh, okay, good. Well, my head's fucked, but at least I'm hot right now. And that is not great.
Yeah, but people also need to learn to stop commenting on like people's bodies. Like,
How do you support your clients if they come to training with eating disorders or just disordered eating of their own?
I think with like a lot of my clients is about reframing what training means to them and their whys as to why they want to train. Again, if there are like physique goals, that's absolutely fine, but we need something a little bit more sustainable than that, and a little bit more perhaps like fueled by enjoyment and curiosity. And a lot of my approach is like, cool, let's see if we can like feel stronger. Let's see if we can feel like we can access these skills. Let's learn something new. Let's feel good in how we move. Let's develop that like sustainability so that your training lasts you for years and years to come. And a lot of it is sort of navigating mindset around an individual's training. It's not as easy to quantify, obviously, like someone's mindset. It can take a couple of sessions to really sit down and talk to someone about it and slowly start to help them reframe what it means, or a couple of different approaches might be needed. But I think largely it's about patience and not forcing someone. It's also about the language that you use. I'm quite careful with like the wording that I use around training. Like, for example, I don't often use a word exercise. Like if there's like, I don't know, say we're doing a superset of like squats and plyos, I will never call it, okay, the first exercise is squats. I always say the first drill is squats, or the first movement we're doing, just because I know that that was a trigger word for me. And I'm just trying to be mindful of people's experience with that word exercise, because I feel like it can be so loaded. So yeah, just taking a little bit more of a informed approach.
What do you think coaches generally can do to be better at supporting their clients when it comes to this sort of stuff?
Well, the simplest thing is like talking to your clients and listening, but then it depends on if you're a good listener or not, if you're an active listener, or if you're asking the right questions. So that's a little bit more nuanced. But I think, I don't know, I feel like the PT courses are pretty shit, if I'm being completely honest. Like they really don't set you up to deal with the types of people that walk into the door. And I think there could be a lot more done to prepare like a budding personal trainer to understand particularly like what type of disordered eating or exercise beliefs people walk into the space with. There could even be like trauma informed CPDs. Not that that's gonna give you any sort of like It's not going to give you all the answers, but it's at least going to help inform how to navigate certain things with certain clients. So I think like from the off, there could be a lot more done from the like exam and training boards. But then it's also, I think, largely down to the PT and like what they can do themselves to understand and learn a little bit more, but to also ask questions and be okay with being a beginner.
I guess what's quite tricky is most people who work in fitness probably came to fitness with already disordered behaviors that they were then almost using fitness to justify.
Yep.
Like 90% of the coaches I know either have acknowledged that they've had an eating disorder in the past and are better now, or are still behaving in really disordered ways and calling it health. Without more people even acknowledging that that's what's happening, maybe then nothing really changes.
Yeah, it's just this like constant battle I feel like we're facing. And it's been my constant gripe recently. Largely, the majority of content that we see on Instagram is all like quick fix based, or it's always, if you're brand new to the fitness space, what is the one thing that you're constantly bombarded by? It's physique changes. And it's like, do these 3 moves in order to get like a six pack or to get, super lean. And majority of the time, the individual who is posting this has not trained that way. They've either got fucking great genetics or they're on gear. Like, and those things, those traits are not shared with the audience. So the audience receiving it, they assume that if they do those 3 things, they're going to eventually look like that. But no other surrounding nuance is taken into consideration. But that type of content is just perpetually pushed because it's quick, it's junk food information, it gets engagement. Whereas, like, I don't know, the periphery of individuals on the outside who are trying to show the good and trying to share the messaging that is sustainable, that is healthier, kind of gets a little bit ignored.
What has strength training done for your body image and your mental well-being?
The biggest thing is actually understanding how I feel in my body and learning a little bit more about the mind muscle connection. Because through my yoga practice, again, being hypermobile, I wasn't really understanding the feedback I was getting when I was practicing. Like, without sounding too arrogant, stuff just felt really easy. Like in postural yoga, I'd be like in the splits, no problem. Be doing all these like contortionist shapes, and I'd be like, okay, I'm kind of here, but I don't really like feel like I'm in my body. Whereas strength training was really fucking humbling. I found it incredibly hard. I couldn't even back squat the 20-kilo bar when I first started. I could like go down, I couldn't come back up. I didn't know how. So strength training has really taught me the mind muscle connection, has taught me a little bit more interoception and understanding what is engaging, what is doing what. But it's also helped me listen to my needs a little bit more and help me respond a bit better to certain cueing. Um, and it's also just helped me feel pretty empowered in the sense that it just feels fucking great to be able to lift a heavy weight, throw a barbell around, but then still have the space and capacity to feel really fluid in my yoga practice, to feel fluid in my handstands, but to also unlock loads of different skills that I've wanted to be able to work on or attain for years. So I think it's just like opened a lot of different doors for me, and it's allowed me to try new movements and sports that I never really considered beforehand and really trust myself. I think that was the biggest thing, just trusting myself.
I love that. Did you know that if you're trans, you're more likely to be hypermobile, and if you're non-binary, you're even more likely to be hypermobile?
Yes, I did know this, and I found it fascinating when I found out because so many of like my trans and non-binary friends were all hypermobile, or like again the connection with POTS and EDS as well is very very common, and also with neurodivergence. And I was like, that's interesting. I don't know if I am neurodivergent or not. I've not like explored it massively, but loads of like friends have told me about these like links over the years. Pretty cool.
Yeah, I think if you're autistic, you're 7 times more likely to also be hypermobile. And if you've got ADHD, you're 6 times more likely to be hypermobile. And if
Wow.
you've got ADHD and you're AFAB, you're more likely to have an eating disorder than otherwise.
Damn, fair enough.
So
Okay.
All of the things are the same thing. Something, whatever the thing is, there's probably just one thing making all of the things happen.
It's so fascinating that, yeah, all those links like correlate into a similar experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Part of me really wants to know why, and then part of me really hopes that nobody finds out why, because for sure the next step is for people to be like, let's turn this gene off, and then we have eugenics.
True. Maybe not.
What would you like to see more of this year?
What I would love actually is stepping away from the trend of skinny talk and stepping away from the pipeline to being a trad wife. I would love that. So it just feels like being back on Tumblr in like 2012, and seeing all the pro Anna content. I would love to step away from all of that.
It does really feel like we've gone back in time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I feel like I spent so much time on pro Anna websites when I was a kid, and now all of a sudden it's on social media, and this is much worse. Like, I had to really go out of my way to see this stuff before.
Yeah.
And now it's just in my eyeballs all by itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Or if you like accidentally click one, or if you click a video, that's all the algorithm's going to feed you. I'm like, I don't want to see it.
I'm so glad I'm not a teenager right now, honestly.
Yeah, same. Like navigating all of that noise must be terrifying and just so confusing.
Do you have any other thoughts on eating disorders and genderqueer identities that you would like to share?
I would largely like to see more access. This is actually a conversation Lorenzo and I have quite a lot. I'd like to see, and I think this is probably more on his end, but he'd like to see more trans man coaches who don't just focus on physical transformations and who push a little bit more feeling strong and training for performance or training for like skills and like not just having the physique in mind. Obviously, I understand that is a huge component when a lot of the people that you're potentially coaching have a lot of gender dysphoria and want to change their physique. Absolutely fine. But I think like you'd like to see more to the fitness space than just that. So I think that'd be pretty cool.
I think a lot of that content that's like, hey, look how manly I look at me with my abs and my pecs. I think it ends up feeding into a lot of that disordered behavior without meaning to. And it just becomes part of all of that fitness noise that is the only thing that matters is aesthetics. And I understand it because you're trying to feel at home in your body.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to feel at home in your body when it doesn't look like what you want it to look like.
Yeah.
But also all of the external pressure of what a man is supposed to look like or what a woman is supposed to look like. All of that stuff creates the way that we interact with our bodies sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And it just becomes this like feedback loop of, okay, well, I'm just going to do these crazy things because it's the only way that I can feel good. But then do you ever get to feel good, or does it always have to be more?
Yeah, well, that's it. It's like, do you actually enjoy training, or is it becoming more of a chore because you're only doing it because you want to look a certain way, not for the enjoyment of it? And I feel like when I was in that headspace, I was so dissociated from how I actually felt that took me further out of my body. And now, like training because I do really love it, that's brought me more into my body. So as a result, that's kind of like balanced out the surrounding feelings of dysmorphia and dysphoria that I've had. But then also like enabled me to feel like physique goals are still attainable because my training isn't solely about that anymore.
When you're training because you enjoy training, your body becomes what it needs to be to do whatever the thing that you're doing is. And accepting that means that you get to do the thing that you're doing without stressing about what you look like. But you also end up just building a body that looks cool anyway because you're building some muscle because you're doing the thing.
Yeah, especially, for a lot of like queer people, I think the gym, for a lot of people anyway, the gym is a fucking intimidating environment. But like add on top, the layer of being queer, I think it adds so much additional pressure and fear.
I'm just super grateful to Olive for giving us their time. I had to cut the chat down quite a bit to fit into the episode. And so if people are into it, I would totally be inviting Olive back. I feel like I could talk to them for ages. So if you want to hear more from them, let me know and I'll give them a shout because, yeah, they just have so much to say. Now, as we all know, I've struggled with my own disordered eating a lot over the years. When I was 10, some of you already know this story. My mum signed me up to this fat loss show on TV for kids. And it was basically a bunch of grown-ups telling me strategies for how I can lose weight, like drinking a sip of water between every mouthful of food and putting an elastic band around my wrist so that I can flick it when I get hungry. And I really fucking hated everything about that experience, but it stayed with me, I guess, for the rest of my life so far, anyways. And a lot of the things that I learned were repeated later when I was on like pro anorexia websites as a teenager. And I actually don't even know if I was a fat kid, really, but I always remember myself as a fat kid and I always think of myself as fat historically. And it always takes me by surprise sometimes when I see photos of me from the periods where in my head, I was like the most obsessed with like weight and body image and food. And then I'm looking at it and these are some of the skinniest photos of me. And it's always a bit of a mind fuck, isn't it? Because memories can't always be trusted, can they? And that's the illness, right? Because it's telling you these stories that are forcing you to then behave in ways that seem like they're the answer. And then that's how you're coping with whatever you're feeling instead of actually feeling what you're feeling and dealing with the thing itself. And it's hard, especially when you're in it. And it's really interesting when you're not in it, when you're somewhere further away, to look back on these feelings and these thoughts and these behaviors and be like, what a crazy thing to do. Now, next up, we're going to hear from a therapist that helps people recover from their eating disorders. And she's actually struggled with bulimia herself. And I think sometimes in search of therapists, finding someone who has actually been through the same thing as you and those same experiences, it can be really helpful. So as someone who has also struggled with bulimia, I always really enjoy talking to Rachel. I think she has a lot of really interesting things to say and some interesting strategies that might be useful for anyone listening as well. And she also brings a bit of hope where it's like, can people fully recover from an eating disorder? She says yes. And it was really interesting for me editing this bit because when I recorded this interview with Rachel, I'd only recently been in the middle of like a bit of a struggle. And now I'm fine again. And it feels wild how far apart my thoughts today and my thoughts around Christmas were. And I guess my reward for taking so long to finish this episode is that I've come far enough out the other end. I can have this like retrospective understanding of myself a bit. So that's kind of cool. I hope you enjoy this next section.
I am Rachel Evans. I have a PhD in the psychology of eating. I have my own experience with an eating disorder, starting with restrictive eating, what you might label as orthorexia, like clean eating, then going on to extreme hunger, binging, then making myself throw up because I thought that that was the way to get rid of the food. I didn't realize how damaging it was. So going through phases of like being in denial, realizing I have a problem, not knowing what to do about it, seeking help at points. I've kind of been through that whole experience myself, which made me really motivated to work with other people.
What is an eating disorder and does that differ and how from disordered eating?
An eating disorder is something that is defined by the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which we're on version 5. So that is made through a consensus of leading experts. You might have heard people talk about anorexia. It's what people think is the most common eating disorder. It does often show that in statistics, but I think, well, how many people are slipping through the net that are struggling with other things? So that would be someone is restricting what they're eating and their energy intake. The current criteria, that is a significantly low body weight. But actually, we know that a lot of people who are struggling, actually, their body weight might not change or it might not get low enough to meet this criteria. So automatically, they're feeling invalidated. They might not be able to access support, even though their lived experience is one of an eating disorder without a low body weight. So people will have an intense fear of gaining weight or fear of becoming fat, even if, if their body weight has reduced, if they've got a low body weight, objectively, they are not fat, inverted commas. but that maybe they perceive themselves as that. The criteria say increased importance on weight and shape, and people don't recognize if they have a low weight, how serious it is and the impacts that it could have on their physical health. And often I think in this case, like I mentioned about being in denial myself, that you don't realize it's happening because you're so in those behaviors, and it feels like you have to follow the food rules. So that's one. Binge eating is when people are eating a large quantity of food. So it's kind of defined as more than most people would in those circumstances, which is a little bit vague. But like for an example, I guess, like, if you went to the cinema, you might buy a large popcorn and eat it like, while you're watching the film and not be paying attention to what you're doing. That would be expected in that context. Whereas if someone's eating that at home, if it's coming along with these other behaviors, so if it feels like you're eating it quite fast, you're quite secretive, you feel like you've got a loss of control, maybe you're eating that when you're not hungry, if you've got a lot of guilt and shame around that behavior, that could possibly indicate that you are binge eating, which is slightly different to overeating. Doesn't come with those other aspects that I mentioned always about the guilt, the shame, the loss of control, like the quantity of food. So there is a subjective element to it in a way, which I think is quite tricky. And also, as I'm saying these definitions, I'm worrying that I'm coming across as judgmental, because to me, I think that's sometimes how the definitions feel on paper. So when I work with clients, it would be very much exploring like what is going on for you, what's the impact that this is having on you and your life. And then also bulimia. So again, there's an importance on weight and shape, that someone might be binge eating, as we spoke about before. What is binge eating? And then also trying to compensate for that or make up for that. Okay, where it gets more confusing is you can also have anorexia and be purging as well. But with bulimia, it would be the binge, the quantity of food that you've eaten in the first place. And then the strategies to purge might be making yourself vomit, making yourself throw up, taking laxatives, fasting, excessive exercise. It might be misusing medications like weight loss drugs or steroids. Are there specified feeding or eating disorders, which actually about 50% of people diagnosed with an eating disorder fit into this category? But essentially you fit into this category because you don't quite fit into the other categories. So it's like the characteristics of people's eating and how they're thinking about their body weight and shape is causing them a lot of distress that has been recognized by the medical establishment, but they don't fit into one of these diagnostic criteria. So I think often services, you need to meet these criteria to access support, but there are a lot of downfalls in that often people don't stay in one category. So it's more like, how is it impacting you physically, mentally, your relationships? Are you avoiding going out for meals because of what food is available there, and your worries about that? Career, hobbies, basically every area of life. How is what you're eating and how you feel about your body, weight and shape impacting that?
What would disordered eating be?
Yeah, so basically it's disordered eating if it doesn't quite fit the criteria for an eating disorder. But then again, I think you can have a conversation about this as well, because some things that I might think, oh, is that disordered eating? People might say, oh, I actually feel okay about this. So right now there's a lot around about intermittent fasting. I think intermittent fasting is on the verge of being disordered eating or even an eating disorder, depending on how you're doing it and the impacts of it. But other people might say, well, actually, no, I don't mind missing brunch with my friends because that's not in my eating window and I feel fine. It's making me healthier. So it's not disordered eating. Whereas I feel like most of my clients that I work with, that sort of behavior would probably be having a negative impact on their overall well-being and their overall quality of life. So I think it's really tricky that a lot of things that are diet culture are so normalized now, but is it disordered eating? Is it not? I don't think there's a clear cut like this goes in the disordered eating box.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because within the fitness space, the way the majority of people talk sounds really disordered. But it's hard to know if I'm just seeing that because I'm coming from a place where that was all I could think about.
Yeah. So I guess another example is like, if someone literally takes scales to a restaurant to weigh their food, to me, again, like you say, with my background of having had an eating disorder, if I started doing that again, I just think, where would it end up for me? Like, I would probably be so stressed if the amount was over. Would that me taking those scales and being focused on that overshadow my conversation with other people?
Can you talk a little bit about Arthrid as well? What is that? Who does that affect? Is that in the same class as the other eating disorders?
Yeah, super important. So I suppose I've talked about the ones mostly that are like based on weight and shape. ARFID also, so that stands for avoidant restrictive intake disorder. So I guess stereotypically in that, people would have a narrow range of foods that they are able to eat for various reasons. And actually, we haven't come into the reasons of, why people might be diagnosed with anorexia or bulimia or the other eating disorders. It could be to do with like the sensory side of certain foods. It could be to do with like a fear of choking. If you're stepping back, what impact is this having on somebody's life to be able to eat this restricted range of foods? Maybe they're not meeting their nutrient requirements. So what would happen in that case? Maybe someone would have like supplements or something like that. Maybe someone would decide that I want to go to therapy to try and have a wider range of foods.
Is that something that's usually only kids that are affected by it? Like, do people grow out of it, or is it something that can last someone their whole lives?
I think it depends the reasons that someone has it. I think potentially if it's to do with the sensory qualities of the food, or if someone is also neurodivergent and it ties into that as well, maybe it is something that is longer lasting. However, I do think, there's a possibility for change depending on the individual person. I think that if it's something to do with choking, actually I have worked with clients through hypnotherapy on things like that. So I think if it's based on an experience, there's potentially more possibility to change it because you're going back to process that experience and what the person has taken from that experience.
If someone's struggled with an eating disorder and then they've like recovered and they're generally better, is it something that you can be better, or will it always be there? Is there always that possibility that you're just going to fall back down those same behaviours that used to consume you?
It's very individual. So I think if we look like what are the reasons that someone would have an eating disorder in the first place, it might be that that eating disorder is a coping mechanism for something. So potentially during recovery, you learn other coping mechanisms, or the thing that you needed to cope with isn't there anymore. So potentially it wouldn't come back if you know how to deal with those situations in a different way. So some examples maybe like if people are binge eating, that can often feel quite soothing. Like I've been in it myself when you are like taking the food out of the packet. It's kind of like a little bit hypnotic actually. You're like in the zone in that you don't have to think about the other worries that you've got. So something like that. But if I learn how to deal with those feelings that I had that led to a binge in a different way, I don't need to binge to get that anymore. If you're restricting your food intake as well, that can be a coping mechanism in terms of it's quite numbing. You're blunting your emotions because you're not giving your brain what it needs in terms of neurotransmitters. So if it has had that benefit, but you learn how to deal with those situations in a different way, that you don't need that coping mechanism, then potentially you don't need to go back to it. And that's not to say that the thought might never come up. So I feel like I've fully recovered from bulimia, but every so often, like I can't actually remember the last time, but I remember it. So I feel like I recovered in 2017 was like the year I stopped had my last binge and purge episode and like stopped restricting and over exercising. But without going into the whole scenario, something happened in 2021. I was making a wedding cake for my friend because her wedding had been called off for COVID, and she could only have 20 people. So I was making her wedding cake. Long story short, I put so much pressure on myself. It was like 10 o'clock the night before I needed the cake. I needed some more sugar and had to go to the shop, and I was so stressed out. And then I had the thought, you could make yourself sick. But I think the difference is in that situation, it didn't feel like it was fused to me. It didn't feel like it was attached to me. It doesn't feel like I absolutely have to go and act on that. It felt more like my brain is saying, you've pushed all your buttons here today, which I'm more aware of what the reasons were why I was doing that behavior in the first place. And actually part of it was avoidance of emotions and things. So it felt more like, okay, this is a thought. Like, do you know, if you've ever done meditation or yoga and things, when they're like, imagine your thought like a cloud. When I was so in the eating disorder, that thought would not be a cloud. That thought would be part of me that I could not do anything different but act on it. I was like compelled to do it and I did not know how not to. Whereas if it ever comes up now, sometimes it might be more of an old thought like, oh, in this situation, I used to feel this. And I would think about it in that sense, more like it's a memory. And I feel recovered because it's not true for me now. I have the analogy of like bees. It's like, I imagine if you're a beekeeper and you've got that beekeeper's hat on, but all the bees are inside. To me, that's what it felt like having an eating disorder. People can tell you like, oh, that food's not scary, but you don't believe it because there's all those bees buzzing around. There's so much noise. And I feel like recovery for me or for a lot of my clients is like you're taking that hat off. Some of the bees are coming out. So it doesn't bother you to the same extent. I felt recovered because I had so much more freedom.
How can people work through those feelings of fear when they're trying to recover and change their behaviours, when that's also often compounded with gaining weight?
I think it can be really tricky. I think when you bring gender identity into it as well, and if someone is trans and what their body looks like and their expectations of what their body might look like, I think it actually really starts with looking like what is going on here. Like, what are the reasons for me doing these behaviors in the first place, which we did touch on a little bit in terms of like the coping mechanisms, but it can also be like an expression of pain or something like that. And so I think it's like you don't really know what is a solution or a different option until you know what this behavior was trying to help you with in the first place. I'm not sure about the people that you've interviewed, but quite often, my clients are like, well, I tried to change my body and I still wasn't completely happy. I suppose it would probably be conversations around like, how is what you're doing working out for you? Addressing like where their fears have come from. Like, is it specific incidents of bullying, of discrimination? Is it like slower drip feed of diet culture or seeing what your parents are doing? Like, where did you get these ideas? And start to challenge that. But I feel like often when you have an eating disorder, your world gets so small because you are so focused on food. And even with something like ARFID, it can be the worrying about if something's going to be available that you can eat. If you go out, for example, preparing something just right. So it's like your world has really shrunk.
What are some of the health issues that can come along with eating disorders?
So many. I would say to people, I can talk a little bit about it, but obviously I'm not a medical doctor. In terms of restricting, obviously you're like depriving every system in your body of getting enough. So if you're restricting for long enough, those systems can start to shut down. So that would be the major one, especially if it's something like your heart. People die from eating disorders. We always think, I thought, I'm not going to be that person, am I? It's not going to happen to me, but it does happen to people. So yeah. And it can be the other things that I think people can often be more concerned about, because sometimes health feels like a long-term concern, or it feels far away that that's going to happen to you. But I think for me, it was more worried about like my hair was falling out so much. So I was worried about that. Like my skin was really dry. I didn't have periods because I wasn't eating enough fat for my body to be able to, do those processes. So it could be the physical things like that. In terms of purging, actually, if it's something like making yourself throw up, you're potentially really damaging your body in terms of electrolyte levels. And that can have an impact on your heart. Then you can die from that. But it's also things like your throat, your teeth, even your eyes. If you're vomiting, like you can, burst blood vessel in your eye, binging, you could rupture your stomach. Like there's all these things. But I feel like either sometimes they're not immediately apparent. And also, I think we can really discount them. So I think this conversation, it's a really important one to have, because I think sometimes people genuinely don't realize, like, what is this doing to my body? Because maybe you're so focused on either I'm being healthy doing this, if you're only eating healthy, quote unquote, foods, or you're just so in it that you have to follow the rule that you don't want to hear anything different. So I think it's an important conversation to have, but people minimize it. I've spoken to people who are like, well, yeah, I'm throwing up blood, but I'm probably all right. And I'm like, do you think, shall we go to the doctors? I have a conversation around that informed consent and everything. But I think it's really easy when you're so in it to minimize those things. So I think my takeaway from people would be, if you're noticing that something isn't right physically, or it's not how it was, maybe that is an indication to go and get support. But I also know that comes along with so much stuff that people are thinking like, oh, but you're going to take this coping away from me, or I'm not ready for change. So I absolutely know it's not that easy, but you could be that person who has lifelong consequences because of this.
It's quite a scary thing to go to the doctor and ask for help for something like an eating disorder, because there's that worry that maybe admitting that you need help with this thing means they're going to stop helping you with other things.
Yes. I usually say if I do a podcast or something, like if you go to the doctors, if you can tell the receptionist about what you want to speak about, because then they might be able to put you with a different doctor. Do you know, some people go to the GP and they've had the same doctor their whole life and they have a really good relationship with them and they really like them. I was the person who just got put with whatever doctor was free. So I never really felt like I trusted that GP. And sometimes within the service, there are people who understand more about eating disorders or about these things. And unfortunately, in the UK, services don't always seem very integrated. You know, I haven't worked with many trans people, but I've worked with a few, and it's like, well, we could give you support for that, or we could give you eating disorder support, but we can't do both integrated. And it's like, but it's not even two sides of the same coin, but like this is all together. It's not separate things that are going on here. So just a side point, like if you're not offered adequate support, it's not that you're not deserving. It's not something about you. It is just literally the state of the NHS at the moment.
With the trans clients that you've worked with, have you noticed any connections between like body dysmorphia and gender dysphoria?
Yes, definitely. And I think for me that I've been like, okay, how do I navigate this with the client? It's been very much like a conversation. We're just exploring it together. What is going on here? What do they feel is going to be the best next steps for them in that? Like, where can I support them? Because I think I'm going to put my foot in my mouth here because I don't know how to say it differently. But I think there comes a point when you're like, I'm really uncomfortable in my body, but the things that it would take to change that and change your body to how you think you would be happy with it, in terms of if it was severely restricting, come along with a lot of other consequences that it's not realistic to achieve that. Does that make sense? If you would have to restrict so much or take weight loss medication for the rest of your life to achieve that outcome, and we've said, okay, but it's also impacting, I can't see my friends, I can't do this, it's impacting my health. I think for me, that conversation is, where can they go forward and where are they like, this is what I'm accepting and this is what I'm changing and this is how I'm also using how I'm eating to deal with all of the stress of this and the discrimination and these things that I'm getting every day. So I think for me, because I don't have that experience myself, that's a conversation that I try to navigate with my client.
I guess in those situations, a lot of the time, what could solve a lot of those body image issues is access to gender affirming care.
Mm-hmm.
And if we didn't live in a country where waiting lists are in some places like 20 years long, no one's getting help because the government hates us. It doesn't leave people with many options.
Mm-hmm.
So then either you pay privately, which costs thousands of pounds, or you buy DIY concoctions online or from people who haven't used all of the medication. Maybe it's gone off, but it's left, so you could take it. Or you start behaving in disordered ways to restrict how much you're eating, to restrict how much body fat is on your body, to create silhouettes in the only way you have available to you.
Yeah, I think it's tricky because I guess because I'm a psychologist, I feel like my role in that situation, if people are coming to me saying, me trying to get that silhouette, like you say, in the ways that you have just mentioned, is actually also having all these other negative impacts, that people reach the decision point, I think sometimes when they're starting to question, is it worth it? Or what is this doing to my health? Because some of those things you mentioned are potentially lifelong damaging effects. I can totally understand why people would feel that's worth it. So it's not a judgment piece, but I guess with my specific clients, they're coming to me because they've had that decision point where they're like, actually, they're telling me, I'm not telling them they have to know how to cope or not even be okay with, but like manage. Is that the word? I'm not sure what the word is. How they're feeling about their body until they can access some other support without doing what they're doing now. So is it possible? I think it is. But I think in those situations, it's coming from the person to say, actually, I've decided I want to make this change, which I think is really key.
Can I tell you some fun facts that are mortifying?
Go on then.
Again, I'm just sharing those trans eating disorder stats that I shared with you at the beginning. Two-part question. Any thoughts on why maybe trans people are more likely to have eating disorders than cis people? And also any thoughts on why some people are more likely to have eating disorders than others?
Yeah, just taking the second one first. So there is emerging evidence that genetics plays a role. Personally, I don't think it's like, here's a gene for an eating disorder. I think there are certain, maybe what word do you want to call them, like tendencies or traits or something like that, that might predispose you to one. So that's almost like increase the chances. So like you said about ADHD can then potentially lead to binge eating, whether that could be using food as a regulation tool, or it could be like, if someone gets so hyper focused on something that they forget to eat and then they're really hungry. And once they start eating, then they start a binge. That is actually a place that we can intervene to be like, okay, great. Hyperfocus can be really positive. You've noticed it's not in this situation. Is there something we can do here that you want to do? So yeah, on one hand, I think maybe people who might self-identify as like a perfectionist, for example, or feel like they have quite black and white thinking, something like that, people could be predisposed. However, also the groups that you mentioned, so someone who is neurodiverse, someone who has a different gender identity, is not, cis, that they will probably experiencing more discrimination. They're probably experiencing, like you mentioned earlier, about gender dysphoria. They have these, you might like in a text, if you're reading a textbook, call them stressors. Like you've got a whole load more stresses dumped on you that you're having to navigate and to deal with in terms of like interpersonal, but also like with yourself and how you're feeling about yourself in this world. So I think it makes sense that if we think of an eating disorder like as a coping mechanism, as a way that you can change your body, like sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, but if people have been successful in changing their body with that, or even like an expression of pain that, for some people, it's like a diet that has then turned into an eating disorder with a whole lot of other factors, involved in there. But for some people, it could be that, they weren't hungry because they were feeling really stressed and it feels like their digestion's shut off. And then once they've restricted, not on purpose, like accidentally restricted almost for a certain amount of time, then they start becoming more rigid because they're not giving their brain, what it needs to function optimally. And then that can turn into an eating disorder. Obviously, like I said, there's more factors involved. So I think there are all these different pieces.
I don't know what the stats are. I didn't write it down. But if you've got ADHD, you're more likely to also have binge eating disorder.
Mhm.
And as an ADHD non-binary person who has for sure never clinically diagnosed, but had binge eating and purging, is that bulimia? I don't know. I feel almost validated because a lot of the time people are like, oh, non-binary, you made that up. Did I?
Do you feel, I guess, do you feel how I feel about the classification of eating disorders? Like we've had to put this on in a box when it's actually a spectrum. Like we need to put gender in a box, but actually.
Yeah, especially with certain eating disorders being able to access more help than other eating disorders, when actually it's all a blend. Like for me personally, obviously this isn't about me, but for me personally, I've had all of them.
Yeah.
Every single one.
I think how I work through it with my clients is working through that understanding of like, what are all these things that you're living with and you're dealing with? It makes sense that you're trying to cope with them the best you can because we don't often get taught how to cope in a way that is actually going to be helpful for us. We don't often get taught how to regulate our nervous system. You probably just get taught, like, especially growing up in the UK, like, stop crying, save your tears about that, where you're like, oh, okay, right, thanks. Not actually processing this emotion here. I don't think there's one cause of an eating disorder. I don't think that to recover, you even need to understand why you were in that situation. However, I do think it's very helpful to like get an understanding that works for you of it so that if a bee does come up, you can have that little conversation with yourself. Or if sometimes my clients explain that they just like automatically went back to the behavior without thinking about it. But instead of saying, right, okay, it's a relapse, everything's gone out the window, I'm a terrible person, I'm so rubbish because now I've done that behavior one time. Actually, I think, like I was saying, the self-awareness, the skill is to step back and be like, okay, what was going on in that situation that triggered this? I know I don't want to go back to that because I know what life was like when I was in that situation before. So like, what tools can I use? How can I avoid that trigger? It's not always possible to avoid a trigger, is it? But if you can, what can I change in this situation? What support do I need? To like, when you were asking me earlier about what do I think about recovery, I think it's learning those skills to be out, I don't want to say get back on track, that's very diety, but, you know, to get into that place that you potentially were feeling a bit more balanced around food or a bit more stable, or not engaging in behaviors that were making you upset and distressed around it.
What can people do to support their loved ones if they're struggling with an eating disorder?
Yeah, I think just know that it's not your loved one's fault. Like, I think a stereotype of eating disorders is either in terms of like vanity or something that they could just stop doing if they wanted to. But like, my lived experience of it is not that I could just stop this. If I wanted to do this enough, I would not just stop, because it was supported by, you know, so many different reasons why I was doing it. So it's not that your loved one doesn't care. It's tricky, isn't it? Because I think if you can see someone going through it and they're so in denial, it is really difficult. But I think it's about trying to hold space for them, trying to be mindful. Like, if you've learned a little bit, like even just stuff like invite them to events that don't involve food. You know, like, you might be having to put yourself out there a little bit in order to be able to support them more. So I think learning about it, but also knowing that your loved one probably doesn't exactly fit what you've learned. I feel like trying to avoid diet comments is a good general rule. I think just let them know if you're able to. I think this is a thing as well, assessing your capacity to how much you can support them. But if you're able to, just letting them know, right, you can talk to me when you're ready. Like, go for a walk. People tend to talk more on a walk, don't they? It's so tricky, isn't it? Because if you love someone so much, you want them to change, but that pushing them, like if they've got all the bees in that hat. I remember my dad crying and saying, "You're going to be in hospital." My dad doesn't cry. And I was just like, "Nah, I'm fine."
How can personal trainers better support their clients if they have histories of eating disorders or disordered eating?
I think even just stuff like, just keep checking in with your client, asking them like, "Oh, how is that for you?" Because I feel like, so for me, I would never have a meal plan now. It just doesn't appeal to me. I don't want to be told what to eat when. Actually, some people might enjoy that structure. Maybe they are working on a certain goal to like gain muscle or something. So I think just checking in with them, okay, how is this conversation making you feel? Like, does that feel achievable for you? What does that remind you of? It obviously depends on the relationship, doesn't it? If you're building a relationship with this person. Like, as much as you can, not assuming stuff about them. I think it's really tricky, but like, I joined a gym and the person was like, "Oh, why are you joining the gym?" And I was like, "Oh, well, you know, I've been doing my home workout." This was post recovery. I wanted to get back into it. There were some personal training sessions and I said, "Oh, I've got an event coming up." And she was like, "Oh, tell me about your dress." And I told her, and she's like, "Okay, so you want to tone up your arms." I was like, I did not ask for, I didn't say that. I just thought, I did not ask for your opinion about my arms in this dress. So I think trying to keep it very client centered and working on their goals. And also, I think this is something that I also need to work on as a psychologist. But like, do you know when you think like, I could really help you get to your goals and I could throw all this stuff at you and we can do this and we can do that. And like, you know, maybe a personal trainer listening, maybe a part of you is thinking, "Oh, but if we worked on nutrition, you'd be able to lift heavier." But your client is like, "Actually, do you know what? For me, that's a no-go. I'm just happy what I'm eating now. I feel really stable." But there's that part of you that's like, "But you can get to this goal better." Like, I think it's about keeping yourself in check sometimes with that kind of thing.
Could you give an example of a couple of tools?
Yes. So actually, if you don't mind putting it in the show notes, I've got a Instagram post. It's like 35 self-regulation tools, because it kind of goes back to what I was saying about the eating disorder having a purpose, or like even these thoughts. I think sometimes to regulate ourselves, you might want to scream into a pillow, or it might be like a physical jump up and down. Exercise isn't part of your eating disorder, like go for a run, you know, something like that to get it out. Whereas sometimes you might need more grounding, you might need more soothing. But if you needed something physical and you're trying to ground yourself, you're probably going to get more annoyed about it. So I do like really quick things, which is that like 5 things that you can see. I think the thing with that kind of stuff is like, if it works for you, it's actually really easy. You can do it anywhere. You're like, "Oh my God, this is like fantastic." But if it doesn't work, you're like, "Well, that was shit." This person's a terrible psychologist. But give it a go, because you don't know if it works unless you've done it. Even like if you feel like very highly like anxious, or there's a lot going on and you want to ground or regulate, even just breathing, take a deep breath in. And then as you breathe out, pretend that you're breathing out through a straw. It's like, If you just do it one time now, it's very calming. Sometimes I do it with my kids when I'm like, put your shoes on. I want to shout at them to put their shoes on and they're not going to. No, through a straw, like pursed lips, like. You can breathe out slow. You feel like you're trying to make bubbles in your Coke. Bubbles. Well, anyway, I find it quite regulating. I don't think Penny does. So yeah, I think sometimes it's just about noticing like, okay, what is going on for me? Am I feeling angry about this podcast? Or do I not know how I'm feeling at all? Is it made me feel sad? If you feel sad, do you want to just wrap yourself in a blanket and be like, right, I know I need to do that job, but I'm going to give myself 10 minutes.
The fitness space is full of so much like contradictory advice with influencers often glorifying their own binge restrict behaviors to sell their diet programs and whatnot. How can people tell the difference between like actual health behaviors that is like useful stuff that you should be doing for the betterment of yourself versus disordered behaviors that will lead you to chaos?
Don't think you can. I mean, so my automatic turn off at the minute is when people are like the truth, or like, do you know if they're overinflating their claims, then to me that is an automatic turn off at the moment. And obviously that's like popular on Instagram. So people are probably going to have loads of followers. So you can't really trust, this person got lots of followers, what they're saying is going to be helpful. I think it comes back to like, how does it feel for you? Because in the very beginning, when we were talking about disordered eating, we were saying like someone might do intermittent fasting and say they feel fine. My dad tells me when he does it, he feels fine. I'm like, okay, good for you. It's not for me, but you do you. So I think if you're curious to try it, I mean, now I'm recovered, there's that alarm bell that goes off for me like, yeah, I'm not going to start cutting out all those food groups. But if, something was making you curious to try it, I think it would just be that self-awareness of like, okay, how is this impacting me? Because even stuff like drink a glass of water when you wake up, like there's so much there. Oh, you should drink warm water. Oh no, you should drink cold water. You should drink lemon water. Don't drink lemon water because that's bad because of da 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 da. Like, if you're thirsty in the morning, drink some water. Do you like lemon in it? Yes, you like lemon in it. Like, I think it's taking a little bit of ownership back. Like, this person has found the answer that works for them, but that is not the answer that works for you because you're a different person. You're an individual. I think it's really easy when everyone's selling their blueprint, but it doesn't mean it's going to work for you, even if it worked for other people. So I think it's just being a little bit critical of how it's impacted you.
Any other thoughts you'd like to share that you think might be important for people listening?
I think full recovery is possible. I think people definitely have barriers to get there, and some people have more barriers than other people. So I think if that is your goal, keep that as your goal, even if, services might be dismissive of you. And there are, like I said, other things that you can do to support yourself in terms of like, there's this podcast, there's actually quite a lot of eating disorder recovery podcasts. I usually just say, find someone that you like to listen to, because you're going to take it on board more then, aren't you, than the one you think you should be listening to. I think just be mindful of social media because there's so much on there, isn't there, with everything. And also I feel like very much everyone wants to get into an argument in the comment section at the minute on certain things. And I do find myself sucked into it, and I have to remind myself, why are you doing this again? You do not need to be reading everyone's opinions about this. So yeah, I think full recovery is possible. Take the quick wins that you can that are supportive to you. If you haven't spoken to anyone about it, maybe there is somebody that you know that you could speak to. You probably know people that have an eating disorder. They've just not told you because it's not something that we talk about, and I'm really glad that we're talking about it today.
So I'm splitting this episode in two. I don't want it to get too long. I started with over 4 hours of interview content. So to have got the first 2.5 hours down to less than an hour and a half, it was actually a really hard task. And I think there's a lesson in there for me if I do any more big multi-interview episodes in the future. Now, in the next episode, part 2, you're going to hear from Dr. Kai Thomas, a researcher looking into eating disorders in trans populations, so we can get some of the science, as well as Cody from Fed Up, a collective of trans plus, intersex and gender diverse people who believe eating disorders in marginalized communities are social justice issues. Fed Up is working to disrupt the abnormally high rate of eating disorders in trans populations. And then finally, trans athlete H, who shares their personal story of struggling with ARFID and orthorexia and how their eating disorder may have contributed to the injury that left them disabled. They also discuss how their disability forced them to reevaluate their relationship with food and exercise and their body, learning how to love it in ways that didn't really exist before. So it's going to be a really good one. Be sure to come back for part 2. And if you haven't already, follow, subscribe, like, comment, etc. See you later.